You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. This week, I have a real scoop. My guest is author Amanda Bestor-Siegal, and her debut novel, The Caretakers, will be out on April 12th. It has already been named one of 2022's most anticipated crime fictions by Crime Reads. The Caretakers is a deeply compelling and psychological read, told from the perspective of 3 French women and 3 American au pairs living just outside of Paris, and begins with their worst nightmare, the unexpected death of a small boy. The story that follows is as much about solving that mystery as it is about what makes a family, a home, a marriage, how we're defined by others, and how we define ourselves. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Bestor-Siegal, author of The Caretakers. Hello, Amanda. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's very nice to meet you. Can we start by having you tell us a little bit about you and The Caretakers?
Yeah, so The Caretakers is my first novel. I've published some really, really short pieces long ago, but for the most part, this is my first published work. And it's a book about a community of au pairs in the suburbs of Paris. It's an invented suburb. And it opens with the death of a child who was reportedly home alone with one of the au pairs. And so the book is told from 6 points of view, and all women in the town. It's 3 au pairs and then 3 French women in the community. And it mostly takes place before the death of this child and kind of explores the psychology of all these different people and their relationships with one another, and how their kind of miscommunications and misunderstandings between each other ultimately lead to this really tragic incident. And I worked as an au pair in France, so it's not autobiographical, but it was definitely inspired by just the dynamics that I was noticing in that community at the time, and just questions that I had about the reasons that young women moved to France to work this particular job, what we were looking for. And yeah, I think it started kind of as my own private exploration space to figure out that stuff for myself, and then it became this much bigger book.
That was definitely going to be my next question, whether or not you had been an au pair. Because
yeah. Yes.
It seems like you knew the world. Is it like that, where there's a group of au pairs who all sort of gravitate to one another and hang out together?
Yeah, it's really funny because when I tell people now that I moved to France when I was young and didn't know anybody, they're like, "What? Oh my God, that's so scary. You're so brave." And it's like, that was actually the easiest time I ever had making friends anywhere, because it's just all these foreigners. We all are in the same situation. We have the same salary. We have the same hours. So it really, there's this initial push to connect with people really fast. And I think, and that can ultimately lend itself to all of these different kinds of relationships. I did make really, really close friends. Some of my closest friends now are people I met au pairing, but there's also some relationships that are really, I think, sometimes toxic and weird. And it's because you're in this place where you're all so vulnerable and so desperate to not be lonely. And that was something I wanted to explore in the friendships in the book, this kind of just need to have somebody. But yeah, it's a really tight-knit community. Pretty much everybody ends up encountering each other at some point, at least in Paris.
And were you in a suburb?
Yes, I was in a suburb. I was in, I'd say, less suburby suburb than the one in the book. I was in Levallois-Perret, so really right across the street from Paris. I was still on the metro. The suburb in the book is a much more, you have to take the RER. But yeah, I had a lot of friends who were kind of out there. And so I was interested in that kind of the more isolated au pair experience, I think, of being really close to Paris, but very much not in it,
Yeah. How long were you here?
So I ultimately lived in Paris for 4 years. I was only an au pair for that first year, and then I worked a really, really odd smattering of jobs over the next few years just to stay there. I was always on a student visa. And then I returned to the States after 4 years just to pursue an MFA. It wasn't so much a choosing one country or another as just I wanted to do this particular school experience. So yeah, but it was most of my 20s. It was a pretty formative time.
Do you think you would ever move back here again?
Yeah, I think it's kind of my permanent question is where is home. I think if I were to move back to France, it would have to be under really different circumstances than I went there. I think
You don't want to be an au pair again?
no, I'm not allowed. I'm too old.
Okay.
But yeah, I think there's so many ways just logistically in terms of visas and things to live in France as an American. I think I chose one of the harder paths. It really I was sort of on a trajectory that was just going to be a really big hustle, and I think if I were going to go back, I would just want it to be different circumstances, but I don't know. I think my dream is to kind of split my time in multiple places. I think sort of settling anywhere is a bit hard for me.
So I've collected some questions for you.
Mhm.
The first one is this. So the Caretakers is told, as you mentioned, from the perspective of these 6 different women, 3 French, 3 American. But the men loom really large in the story. The husbands, the lovers, the sons, and this possible murder of a young boy.
Mhm.
So why did you choose to focus solely on the women's perspectives?
So I think partly because one of the things that I was thinking about a lot when I started the book was this idea of caretaking and whose role that is. And I think it just often falls to women. And I think, especially when I was au pairing, I was really conscious of how not only are almost every au pair is a woman, not all, but most. Um, I was struck by how much my host mother she had a full-time job, that's why they had an au pair, but she also still ran the house. Like, she did all the laundry, she was my boss effectively. My host father was there and he was lovely, but he it was just there was a very, I think, gendered dynamic in the house in a way that I wasn't really expecting. And it just, I think I didn't really set out saying like I'm only going to write about women, but I think it was just something that ended up happening because I was so interested in this assumption that women are not only that they will do caretaking, but that they'll be good at it. And that's something that as an au pair, I think I really struggled with. Like, I think a lot of au pairs, come to France because they want to be in France, not because they're necessarily super great at taking care of kids. And I think that was a time for me where I had a great relationship with my children, but I think I realized that there's a lot of things about it that I'm not good at. Like, it's just not natural for me. Like, talking to kids and just certain kinds of care they don't come naturally to me. And so all of these women, I think, for me are like that in different ways. Some of them are sort of better at certain kinds of care than others. Some are maybe seem more maternal, but I think all of them have a really hard time like truly connecting and truly giving love and receiving love. And so yeah, and I think also in general, I'm really interested in characters that aren't necessarily I don't want to say likable because I hate that word, but that aren't necessarily showing the prettiest of human behavior. And I think that especially in literature, I just think I feel like there's so many like amazingly complicated, flawed male characters in literature. And it's just, I still feel like women, especially mothers, they're either evil or they're saints. And I really, in this book, I'm just generally interested in writing, I think, in exploring the kind of darker, less attractive behaviors of people in general, and like specifically women, in the ways that we don't necessarily always like our thoughts at the very least, let alone like the way we externally present, doesn't always actually line up with the nice mother, the nice caretaker.
You do a beautiful job of that. Your characters are very multifaceted. There's not any like one dimensional. Even when eventually we learn the characters' backstories, they're never what you would predict from how this character presents themselves and how other people perceive them.
Mhm.
It's always a little bit
surprising, which I found really refreshing because it adds again more depth and profundity to these characters. So three of the characters of these main characters are French, three are American. And in the book, you talk a lot about culture and cultural differences and cultural norms, how we're shaped by where we live and how we're shaped by where our parents have lived. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to embody these six different women? And was there a character that was maybe more challenging than the others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I spent about 6 years writing the book, and really the first four were just character. Like I was barely even thinking about plot. I really spent like months and months with each woman at a time, just trying to get to know her and embody her. And I think again, I was kind of writing towards the things that I was personally curious about or like having a hard time understanding in my own life at the time. And so I think cultural differences were something that throughout my time in France, but especially towards the beginning, it's this constant. I mean, you might know, like I think if you move to another country, there's just this period where you're constantly like amazed by how different things are and things that you wouldn't have expected, like really, really subtle, sometimes just the way people interact socially, or something that's like polite to ask about versus like absolutely don't ask somebody that, just stuff that's really you wouldn't know unless you were immersed in it. And so I think the American characters definitely explore some of those more surprising moments. And then I think from the French side, I had my own history with France, that where in a lot of ways I think I felt more comfortable with French culture than American for a very long time, growing up. And so in a way, I think the French characters for me were my way of exploring the aspects of American culture that I find really baffling. And then in terms of embodying them as people, I also think like it's a balance of our culture informs us so much, but we're also all people. We're all women, all these characters like share things in common. And so I wanted to get to know them first as their own individuals, and then look at how their culture and the places they grew up would have informed that in different ways. In terms of like challenging, I think I'd say Geraldine was not she's the character that definitely required the most research on my part. Just she's a woman of color who is French, born and raised in France. But I did a lot more for all the French characters. I read a lot of memoirs and just read a lot in French. But for her specifically, I read a lot of just memoirs by women, specifically women of color in France who were born in France, because I really wanted to just understand that. I think race is a very different conversation in France than it is in the US. And I'm definitely used to like being in that conversation in a very different way in the US. And so I'd say that was the character who I think required the most like deep dive to get really the nuance of that for me, and to make sure I was doing it as well as I can. Yeah. But I don't know. I think all of them, I at some point was really just getting to know them as individual people, like beyond where they necessarily like came from.
And you were with each one of them one at a time, essentially?
Yeah, I spent at some point later on, I started to like skip around quite a lot to make sure that the book was like, cohering. But for the first few years at least, I really gave myself permission to just spend a lot of time with each character to get to know them.
Yeah, Geraldine is interesting too because she doesn't have as clear cut as of a relationship. She's neither an au pair nor one of these mothers that hires the au pair. So her story is central, but it's not quite as clear cut. So I could see why that would be more challenging too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
We started talking about this a little bit before we were recording, but I find that your book has really strong themes. These themes of self-expression, self-identification, what makes a family, what makes a home. And how do we express ourselves? And what I find so compelling about your book is that you take these questions, and in a lot of books, if we're talking about family, for example, the author will present us black and white. Here's a good family, here's the absence of a good family, and now we understand what family is. But you don't do that. You have examined these questions from 6 completely different perspectives, and each one of them is very understandable. It's very clear and perfectly legitimate. So my question, this is a long-winded way of asking you whether you knew these were the themes you were examining, or did they emerge while you were writing?
I think it was definitely a combination. I think different writers like get into stories in different ways. For me, it's definitely I write to try to understand something that I'm not understanding. So when I started this book, I think I Lou was the first character I wrote, and I think I was really curious about this this idea of moving to another place in the belief that it will somehow make you better or change you, and what happens when it doesn't. And I think that that was something that I think I experienced a lot just in the au pair community in general. And I think Paris, as we know, can be a really idealized place for a lot of people. And so it kind of started just trying to understand that basic question of like, why did we come here? Like, what were we looking for? And then it all of these other themes of about family and identity and grief, they emerged because I was also curious about those things, but I wouldn't say that I set out to explore them. They just came out as I was trying to understand my life during those years. And I think part of the reason that there are 6 characters and that the book kind of grew so much beyond that initial like au pair question was because I was also growing up at the time. Like I really grew up with this book. It was all through my 20s that I was working on it. And so I am, yeah, I think I'm pretty intuitive when I'm writing in terms of letting it kind of following my curiosity, even if it's not necessarily what I set out to explore. I didn't think, for example, that grief would be such a big part of this book. And now looking back, it's easy for me to see, like, of course it was, but it's, yeah, writing for me is definitely a more exploratory process where like themes that are just kind of arise. I think in general, my subconscious is a lot smarter than I am, so I let it do its thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved that. I loved that there is no one answer in real life anyway. So getting to see all these different sides to these questions was satisfying, really satisfying. And you set this story in a very potent time in Paris in 2015. So we go through the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the attacks in Belgium, and then the attacks on November 13th. Can you talk about why you decided to set your story in this time period?
Yeah, I I think well, so I au pair, the year that I was an au pair was the year of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then I had just moved into the center city for during the November 13th attacks, and I think as I was thinking about all these questions of belonging to a place and the desire to belong to a place, I think the terrorist attacks in both instances really like opened up some of those questions for me in ways that were really complicated and uncomfortable sometimes. It really the moment I decided to actually set it then I think partly it was because that was just I was living there. That was my experience of France at the time. But I think I remember after November 13th just seeing this outpouring of social media posts from former au pairs I'd known. I was one of the only au pairs I knew who stayed in France after that first year. So most everyone had gone back to their respective countries. And I remember just sitting in my apartment in Paris, like shaking and seeing all of these posts from people who were in their home countries, like, I used to go to that cafe all the time. Like it just felt so personal to people. And I think I, partly because of my own, some things I had lost my mom right before I moved to France, which was a big reason I moved, although I didn't realize that for many years. But I think I was at a point in my life where I was experiencing grief in a way that I didn't have a lot of space for more complicated kinds of grief. So for me, like when I would see those posts, I would think, but you weren't here. You weren't at that cafe. You didn't lose somebody. There are people here in Paris who lost people. And I just didn't have a lot of, I couldn't understand like how can you grieve or feel like this is personal if you didn't literally lose somebody? And I started to feel like it's all part of this kind of this feeling of belonging. Like when you live in a place, I think it becomes personal, it becomes part of you, you belong to it in a way. But then I think it gets kind of murky and weird when that place is under attack, because you it's like, to really belong to that place, to feel among the attacked, it's like you want one thing, but I don't think you really want the other. And there's this kind of complicated claiming of pain that happens in order to claim the place as your own. So I just was really curious about that. And I think, as I was thinking in general about this desire to belong to a place that we're not from, how that gets complicated when that place is under attack, and specifically in ways that are really attacking the cultural values of that place. Like, I just remember Charlie Hebdo feeling so like almost like an outsider. Like, this is such a specific attack on French values that whatever my personal feelings about them, I'm not French. Like, I can't be French. And everyone's, je suis Charlie. I'm like, I don't, am I? I'm not. And it was just, I thought about it just a lot. This kind of like, this knee jerk response to like belong to the place that is suffering, and like what that means for the people who actually were attacked and are truly grieving, and what are those various levels of grief. And yeah, so I think it all felt very inextricable to me, and I never wanted the terrorist attacks to play, like, I certainly was not writing a thriller or something, like I never wanted them to be a plot device or a part of the plot in that way. But I think the backdrop of that was really important to me, and just how it made us question kind of, to what extent we belong there. I think I as a foreigner, I certainly felt differently afterwards than I did before. Even just, it was just very complicated time. So
Yeah, that's well said. I felt very similarly. I felt, especially with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, I felt like, okay, well, we can all agree that killing journalists is wrong, but the rest of it just felt so complicated that I couldn't really have an opinion on it. But yeah, when the November 13 attacks happened, it was different for me. But I understand it is all complicated, all of these questions. What do we claim as our own and what claims us?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I don't have an answer at all. It's like, I think why
Yeah.
it just felt like that's definitely the setting that all of these questions are going to kind of come up to their maximum and be really, just ever present.
Yeah. So your story starts with this suspicious death of a young boy. Potentially it's a murder. We don't really know. And we sort of circled this story throughout the unfolding of the novel. Like, it starts with it, but then we skip around. Well, it's kind of like we have the central event, and then we have some things that happen before and some things that happen after, sort of spirals around until we get to the reveal, I guess. But there are a number of other crimes that take place. Like, none of these people, many of these people are not morally sound. So obviously nothing else as horrific as a murder, but what kind of drew you to this genre, and how complicated was it for you to find this kind of story structure to support this reveal?
Um, yeah, so I feel like I took a bit of a risk in terms of opening the book with such a dramatic event, because to me this is not a thriller, and it's really not a crime novel. But I think that because of that dramatic opening, I think that it might present that expectation. And I do think it's interesting talking to readers now, because I think there are people who are disappointed by how much it kind of leaves that initial event and really goes deep into the psychology of these women and their backstories and their lives in ways that aren't directly, like, they don't seem directly linked to the death. And for me, that decision to have this really dramatic event and to kind of focus the whole book around it, it wasn't so much about like, here's a dramatic booyah, here's a thing, and it's going to pull you through the book. It was more about me thinking about consequence, and thinking, when I was an au pair, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen? The absolute worst. And I remember, like, I didn't really want to write a book where a child dies. Like, it didn't sound like, I mean, understandably, I think that's a turnoff for a lot of people. And I went back and forth. There were times where I thought like maybe a child gets injured or, it doesn't have to be that bad. But then I thought like, yeah, but it does because this book is like exploring for me like what is the worst consequence of people failing to care for each other and connect with each other? Like what is the worst thing? And that's it. And I totally understand that for some readers it's like nope, I'm out. But I just as an au pair, I mean, it was the first time for me that I was really in charge of children and for an extended period. And I think a lot of au pairs can relate to just how big that fear is. It's like really shocking to encounter, especially when you're still kind of a child yourself and they're not your kids. Like you're responsible for another person's kids. It's just it's scary in some ways. And so for me, the once I decided like I'm going to I'm going to explore the most extreme version of this consequence of this horrible thing that could happen. I think the question was actually like, do I reveal this at the beginning or not? And I think the choice to reveal it at the beginning really was like to give a sort of through line to the story. So even as I knew we were going to go very far away from it at times in the narrative. And I wanted us to still feel kind of rooted in where this was all going. But yeah, it's a trade-off because I think it also does set up an expectation for a certain genre that I think the book then doesn't really totally adhere to. So yeah, structuring a book is really hard.
I mean, I will say that the death is never exploitative or graphic or horrific or shocking in any way. So for people who are turned off by that, don't be worried. It's not like that. And I do think that it sets up a world, and then the story becomes very psychological. So I really enjoyed it.
Are you searching for spiritual guidance? The Heart of You podcast is an exploration into your soul through intuition, spirituality, divination, and unconditional love. Host Annette DeLu is a spiritual guidance coach, intuitive, Akashic, and tarot reader who discusses practical ways to integrate spiritual growth into your everyday life. Listen now to The Heart of You on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
So the excerpt that I'll be reading now is the opening of Charlotte's point of view. Charlotte is the third point of view that we come across in the book, and she is the mother of Julian, the child who died under the care of his au pair. 2 weeks before her youngest son's death, Charlotte Chauvet spent the weekend with her only friend's husband. She would think about this weekend after. She'd wonder about karma. Then she'd wonder if the very fact that she was wondering, that she could even conceive of his death as her fault, that this might be the problem in itself, that she ever expected to have control over her children, their deaths, their births. They arrived without her permission. Why should she have any say in when they leave? The weekend of bliss turned karma, the last where Charlotte would be happy for a long time, began on a Friday night. Charlotte had settled in for the evening with a secret cigarette and a Kronenberg. She kept a 6-pack hidden at the back of the fridge, an easy feat since her husband rarely ventured there himself. Said husband was away for work. Julian was sleeping over at a friend's house. Natalie, her daughter, was out seeing a show. Charlotte was ready to enjoy the forbidden tastes of her youth, the luxuries of a childless, husbandless house. She knew that Louis Duvignier was also functionally single in his adjacent home, his wife having taken their children away for the weekend. But Charlotte did not plan to take action. She'd given up on seducing her neighbor after an apocalyptically awkward dinner a few weeks before, and had since resigned herself to a faithful marriage, a capitulation that she saw as progress on her part. This is not her first marriage. And yet, Charlotte's attempt at growth did nothing to prevent the quiver in her chest when the doorbell rang, when she saw Louis through the window, glancing around like a fugitive. She opened the door, and he peered over her shoulder before saying hello, searching for her husband, her children. That was the moment she knew why he'd come. "There's no one else here," she said. They kissed right there in the front hallway, reckless perhaps with the window and the front door. Charlotte thought of this mid-kiss, interrupted and said, "Wait." She pulled Louis into the living room. He watched her make the phone call, his expression a mixture of hunger and overjoyed surprise, like a child at his birthday party. "Elena," Charlotte said to the phone, "something's come up. I need you to pick Natalie up from her show once it's over." Her au pair was silent on the other end of the line. Then, monotone, "When?" "I don't know. Call her. If she wants to talk to friends after, let her. There's no rush." Charlotte hung up before Elena could protest, though it wasn't necessary. Elena never said no. Louis extended his hand, hovered his trembling fingers near Charlotte's cheek. He mumbled, "I can't believe... I didn't know if you..." Charlotte didn't want to talk, so she planted her mouth on his. After, one thumb pressed against Charlotte's lip, Louis caressed one of her earrings and said, "When I learned that Séverine and Simon would both be out of town..." Charlotte pulled away. "Let's not talk about them." "No, I just meant... It almost felt like fate, like this was meant to happen." "Fate," repeated Charlotte. She smiled at him, a smile she'd practiced, reserved for occasions like these. "Must be."
So, can you tell us this beautiful masterpiece? When does it come out and where can people find it?
So it comes out April 12th. It's coming out with William Morrow, HarperCollins in the US, and then Little Brown UK. So if you're in France, it's probably easier to just order from Little Brown UK. But yeah, it's pretty much available anywhere that you get books, whether, an independent bookstore near you or Amazon. You can just go to Little Brown UK or HarperCollins websites, and they have links to all these places that you can get it. And yeah, it's out in both places on the same day. So, yeah, really soon.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So, this is a very premature question, but what's next for you? Is there another book, perhaps?
Yeah, I am working on the next book. I can't
Good.
say very much about it.
No.
But yeah, I am working on the next book, still kind of trying to navigate. I'm so curious about authors' experiences with just the second book, how in some ways I think I have a strong desire to go in a very different direction, like to do things I completely didn't do in the first book. And then in other ways I'm like, nah, I'm always going to kind of do that thing, So I'm still figuring it out. But yeah, I'm kind of focusing on publicity for just like, it's a kind of wild time right now with the first book, but I'm excited to get back to the grind.
Will there be a book tour?
So we're because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I am having an in-person event in Austin, Texas, which is where I live. Well, that'll be on the 13th, and then there will be a big virtual event, which is a bunch of bookstores kind of co-sponsoring, and then that's all that's planned for now. We'll see beyond that, but I think. Yeah, the idea is I think one good thing that has come out of the pandemic is this realization that virtual events can actually, like so many more people can come to them, and it's, more affordable than sending authors all over the world. So at least for debut authors, I think that seems to be kind of the direction things are going. And I'm really excited. I'm so happy there's going to be an in-person event at all. I was totally not like expecting that. So yeah, so we'll see.
And where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
I am on Instagram at Amanda Bestor-Siegal. That's the only social media place you can find me. And then I have my website, just amandabestor-siegal.com. There's a little like contact box if you want to reach out to me. I do love hearing from readers so much. So yeah, that's where I live on the internet.
Fabulous. Well, I'll put links out so that everybody can find you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and all of authors. This is just great.
Thank you again to Amanda Bestor-Siegal for such an interesting conversation. You can find Amanda on her website at amandabestor-siegal.com. The Caretakers will be out on April 12th through William Morrow and is available wherever books are sold. Please join me next week when my guest will be award-winning author and cartoonist Adrienne Selt. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book, End of the World House. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. If you like this episode, please consider leaving a rating or review and subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the books featured on this podcast, join our book club. Each month, we'll be joined via Zoom by an author I've interviewed on this podcast to learn even more about them and their work. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyforia, that's JennyPhoria, and on my website, jennyforia.com. Storytime in Paris is produced by me as part of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. To check out interviews with previous guests or to discover more great Paris-based podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.